Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie, and we're here for our PCA lecture series. And our guest today is Sebastian Crutch, who's a neuropsychologist, and he's with the University College London Institute of Neurology. So we've had Dr. Crutch last year. He was amazing, and everybody was like, oh, get him back. So here we are. Seb, welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I was trying to remember, it shows a sign of my bad memory that I can't recall if I showed you any slides or pictures last year.
No, you didn't. You just...
Right. So hopefully, at least, even if the words I'm using are a bit repetitive from last year, I hope at least some of the pictures will be new. And obviously, I'm really, really happy to take lots of questions at the end. I get the sense from, usually I would be asking people to ask questions all the way through, but I guess with the muting and unmuting, it's easiest if I just talk at you for about half an hour or so, and then happy to take as many questions as you like.
Wonderful, thank you.
Please do stop me at any point if you want to change that or give people a chance to respond.
Nope, go as long as you want. We're here.
Okay. Well, I suppose I was going to wanted to share these pictures with you. Because this is, I was giving a talk yesterday in London to the Dementia Clinical Network in London, the network of all the hospitals around London, inner and outer London, seeing people with different forms of dementia. And I was telling them that this is, it was working with this gentleman, William Merlin, who is a visual artist who developed Alzheimer's disease, that I first got interested in Alzheimer's or dementia and art and that connection. So Bill was a very well-known, well-renowned artist who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease in 1995. And at that stage, he had actually stopped drawing, but through conversation with one of my lovely colleagues, a nurse called Ron Isaacs, who expressed an interest in seeing what Bill could still do, that he took up his paintbrush again and created this extraordinary series of self-portraits, which I think say an awful lot about both the experience and the biology of Alzheimer's disease, and particularly how it can affect one's ability to see what things are and where things are, as you can see with the difficulty he had with some of the features. When Bill originally shared some of these images, some people naturally said, well, is this not just his artistic expression being shown? And that's why I was particularly interested. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but I was particularly interested in this bottom image, which was when Bill was in seeing us, and we just handed him a piece of paper and a pencil and said, could you just draw a man for us? And what he drew was far more stylish than anything I could manage. But at the end, when he'd drawn it very quickly, he said, no, there's something wrong with this. But he couldn't tell what was wrong. He couldn't tell that he'd drawn both arms coming out of the same shoulder socket. And that for me is an example of something which wasn't his artistic intent. It was an example of a spatial error, a way in which his dementia, his Alzheimer's disease, had affected the cells that enable most of us who don't have one of these conditions to take for granted the ability to place things in the right place, to understand where one thing is in relation to another. So that was really how I got interested in vision in relation to different forms of dementia. And when I'm talking today, I'm going to be talking really about 3 different types of vision, all to do with the brain. So I'm talking about brain sight, not eyesight. And the two of those types are more commonly talked about in the dementia field, and that's the ability to see objects, or so-called visuoperceptual processing, and the ability to see spatial relationships between objects, also called visuospatial processing. But a little, one of the things that people talk less about in my experience in relation to dementia is all the much more basic aspects of vision, which we're not really aware of, but which underpin our ability to see what and where things are. And that's what I call early or basic visual processing skills, which are really supported by the very back of the brain, the occipital lobe of the brain, which unfortunately is one of the areas most hit in PCA. And so these are the sorts of skills that enable you to see one thing against a background, or to discriminate 2 subtly different shapes, or to tell where one point is in space. It's sort of X, Y, Z coordinates, how left, right, up, down, near, far it is. And so I'll be talking a little bit about those sorts of skills. And the other thing I was just going to show you was just an example. Let me just find, maybe if we take this as this page, is just to encourage you that we have been trying to share with people the tools that are out there for clinicians, doctors, healthcare professionals of various different flavors to try and pick up some of these brain sight rather than eyesight problems. And so this is an example of a simple pocket-sized book created by the amazing Elizabeth Warrington and her colleague Merle Galton, which is a pocket-sized book, costs £10, and it has within it a number of tests which are very sensitive to some of the early changes in PCA. And it's possible some of you may have even seen some of these images before, but had them thrust under your nose. And some particularly which seem to be very sensitive for those living with the early stages of PCA. For example, those of you living with the condition may not be able to see them naturally, but these are some fragmented letters. So images of uppercase letters where someone's taken out some of the ink. So they're very patchy. They're like a little sort of matrix of black and white dots. And those of us who don't have a brain sight problem are likely to be able to see those as coherent letters, whereas for people who have degeneration at the back of the brain or other causes of this problem may just see them as dots. They see them as fragmented. And so that's quite a sensitive early test and something that's quite simple to do in the clinic or when you go and see your optometrist or whatever else. And so one of the big things we need to be doing is sharing simple tools, not expecting everyone to be an expert in PCA because it is a relatively rare condition, but sharing simple tools that can enable people to pick up on some of these difficulties. Because I don't know about for you guys, but in the support group we run in London, so it's so sad how many times we've heard the story of, oh, well, we knew something was wrong. We went to our eye health professional. They did some tests. They said, your eyes are healthy. Try some glasses, or we don't know what to do. Come back and see us in a year. And that sense that people, the opportunity to pick up on these difficulties, and even if you didn't know what they were, to refer on to a neurologist or someone who might recognize the actual cause of the difficulty, was missed. And so we want to share as many of these simple assessment tools as we can. I'll just skip on a little bit. One other point I wanted to make prior to talking specifically about PCA was also just to commend all of you and thank you for all that you do to be sharing with other people, such as in this group, with your doctors, with researchers, and with the public more generally, and your friends and family, about the visual problems that you have. Because although lots of people regard PCA as the main sort of visual degenerative condition, the sorts of visual difficulties that you're noticing and living with are beginning to be noticed in a number of different degenerative diseases. So these pictures are just a couple of examples of tests that my colleague Ramona Weil, who works primarily with people with Parkinson's disease, has been using and developing. And because she, just like us, has been very interested in making use of the comments that people coming to her clinic have been making. And a number of them had commented how difficult they find these so-called capture images, which is the images of often distorted numbers and letters that often on the bottom of websites when you're trying to buy something or give your information. The way that computers, they tell the difference between a human being and a computer. They say, look at this image and type in what you say. And lots of people in the clinic were saying how difficult those were. And it seems to be because of the way they sort of skew or bend, distort the numbers and letters. And that certainly chimes with the experience of people in our group. And it's just one of those examples of a way in which I'd like to encourage you, please, to do keep sharing what you find easy and difficult to see, because it's in your comments, in your experiences, that so much, certainly of our research and of our colleagues' research around the world is being driven when you say things and we pick up and try and understand why that experience is taking place. And it helps us to pick up these difficulties in other people and try and help them to realize that that's a natural part of the condition. It's not that there's something else wrong with them or that something yet more unexplained is occurring. And this very complicated picture, and I do apologize, I realize the ridiculousness of showing slides. If you are living with PCA, I realize it's sort of cruel and unusual torture. But for those of you who can see this, I've got a graph on the screen and with two lines that are gradually diverging over time. And that is because once one of the people I met with PCA, although we didn't know it at the time in January 2005, was someone who actually joined one of our studies that was about people who are mildly concerned about their memory, so-called subjective memory complaints. And this was someone who actually came with a friend of his who was taking part in the study, and he came along as a control. He said, oh, I'll help out as one of the people who isn't worried about their memory. And that the first assessment, he said, well, actually, I'm a little bit worried about my memory. And actually what evolved over time was that it wasn't really his memory that was causing him this sort of sense of unease. It was that his visual parts of his brain were gradually changing. And so this graph is in here because we were testing him with tests which aren't designed for picking up visual problems. We were testing him with things like reasoning tests. So verbal reasoning tests like asking people what words mean, like what does calendar mean, but also non-verbal tests which do require visual skills, like which is the missing piece in this puzzle. And it was on those latter tests, those tests that are very heavily visually dependent, where we began to notice this change. He remained very good, if not getting slightly better at the verbal reasoning tests, but it was in these non-verbal tests that his performance began to slip. And so that's just an example that we often share with clinicians, just to remind people that if you have a visual difficulty, then all sorts of tasks become difficult in everyday life and certainly in the clinical setting, because most of us are just thoroughly dependent on our visual skills for navigating in the world around us. And certainly lots in the psychology world, lots of tests of things like reasoning and language and memory are also visually based, and so not very well suited for people with PCA. And so it's really important that when you get assessed by someone that they realize the visual nature of your difficulty, so that they're doing non-visual tests to see how you're managing in other areas. So as I'm sure many of your speakers will have mentioned, this term PCA, posterior cortical atrophy, which literally means back of the brain shrinkage, has been around since about 1988 and was made famous by this LA neurologist called Frank Benson. In the UK, the most famous person that we know of who's talked publicly about living with the condition is this gentleman pictured in the black hat. He's called Terry Pratchett, and he's a science fiction and fantasy novelist who lived with the condition for a number of years. And I think one of the quotes I often share from that original description from Frank Benson, which I'll just read out now, is of one of the patients who he noticed coming to his clinic and presenting in a way that wasn't typical for someone attending a primarily memory-led dementia clinic. So the description goes like this. It says, a 64-year-old former bank executive presented with episodes of anxiety that complicated a slowly progressive disturbance of vision and language. About 8 years earlier, he had noted difficulty reading. He remained at his job, but his secretary had to read to him. Although still able to write, he could not read what he produced. Eventually, he also lost the ability to write and had difficulty finding his way in familiar areas and in performing visually mediated tasks. The problems slowly progressed. He stated that what he saw disappeared before he could sense what it was. On examination, he was alert, oriented, attentive, and in reasonably good physical health. His manner was gracious and his insight was painfully apparent. And I think for a lot of people, living with PCA or knowing, supporting someone who does, I think that in that description, there may be a number of things which chime with one's experience. Certainly the fact that it's not just vision, and that, excuse me, coughing away, and that finding words sometimes can be difficult. But also some of these more unusual experiences, so this sense of looking at something and then having it almost seem to disappear from in front of you. And that's something which I think we're gradually more understanding is to do with eye movements, and which I'll talk about a little bit later. But be good to hear later on when we talk live, as it were, to be able to see whether anything in that description rings true for your experience. The next thing I wanted to do was to show you a short video, during which I'm going to run and get myself a glass of water so I don't cough at you too much. And this is a video in which a gentleman from our support group very kindly helped with a project designed to educate optometrists and ophthalmologists about PCA. And in this video, he is being assessed by my friend and colleague John Schott, who's a neurologist here at UCL. And he's being asked to reach out and grasp John's hand. So this is an example of a simple test that a number of you may have been asked to do, which tests your ability to see where something is. I'll play that now.
My hand moving, you reach and grab it. My nose. Yeah, got it. Well done. I've got my nose. I've got my nose. On my hand. See my hand moving? I can see your toes. Keep looking at me. Can you see my hand moving? Can you see my hand moving? Can you see my hand? Yes. Don't tell me. Where is it? Where is it? Got it. God, where is it? Find it in a minute. Very good. Okay.
Now this gentleman was very good-humoured and very kind to allow us to ask him to do something which we both knew was going to be difficult for him. But I think it shows two aspects of the difficulty of seeing what things are, which those of us who don't live with the condition often find it very difficult to understand. So this idea that sometimes something that's right under your nose simply may not be visible at all. And then secondarily, I don't know if you noticed that at one point he sort of jerked his head back because he suddenly did see the hand, but when he reached to it, he reached to completely the wrong place. And that's because, again, though most of us take it completely for granted, it's an incredibly complicated process by which many cells at the back of the brain receive information from the eyes and then calculate in a constantly ongoing process the exact location of certain objects, left, right, near, far, up, down. And it's that information which then gives our sort of action parts of our brain a target to aim for and generates a movement and a grasp that enables most of us to pick up the things we're after or point to them, etc. But that's very, very difficult for people with PCA. The second video I wanted to show you is not so much about where things are, but about what things are. So this is an audio recording of someone else from our group who has just been shown this picture, which is of Brighton Pier, a coastal town in the south coast of England. Most of people without a visual problem would be able to recognize more or less what this scene is about, you know, that it's outside, etc., within about 200 milliseconds. So I just want you to listen to how this lady goes about trying to describe what it is that's in front of her. I'll just play that video now.
It looks like a park or of maybe a station or a building. So that looks a bit like the thing they're trying to elect for the Olympics. Or it could be the beach. Because down here looks a bit sandy. That looks like bright. Bright. I like that. So you can imagine.
So I don't know if those of you, I don't know if you could hear it. Could you hear that okay? Jamie, you're shaking your head. Was that difficult to hear? You can see the picture though? Okay, let me just explain then. She was saying, oh, I don't know quite what that is. It looks like it might be a railway station or a building site, or it might be what they're trying to erect for the Olympics. And then she pauses and then she says, oh no, it might be the beach. Because look, down here it's a bit sandy. Yeah, I think it might be the beach, Brighton or somewhere like that. So she uses all of the many, many skills that are very well preserved, her knowledge of the world, her deduction skills, her language, to explore this image. But essentially she's seeing it in small chunks. Whereas when I look at this scene, I see the whole, I see the sky, the ground, the sea, the pier, all integrated as one whole. She sees sections, and you can completely understand why she's saying what she's saying. So for example, when she's saying, oh, it looks a bit like a station, maybe she's looking at the legs of the pier and thinking they look like railway sleepers. Or maybe when she says it's the thing, looks like the thing they're trying to erect for the Olympics, there's a building on the end of the pier, and maybe she's thinking that that looks a bit like a sports stadium. So you can completely understand why she's saying what she's saying, but her experience of this world, of this image, is very fragmented, like the pieces of a puzzle. And it takes her all of her ingenuity, and a lot longer than me and other people to piece together those pieces and understand the whole. Can I just check from Jamie's head nod? Did you hear the sound for the first video okay? Okay-ish, okay. I'm going to try and play you a short clip, or Jamie, is it easiest for you to share it? It's that link I sent you earlier. I'll try playing it, but you give me the sign if it's not working too well. Let me find a simple clip for you. I'll just turn my volume up in case that's an issue.
Ordinary eye.
And so I'll try and play this to you. This is, we have worked recently with an animator, a filmmaker, who worked with some of the members of our group and tried to create something which reflected their experiences, because so often people have said it's very difficult to describe what it's like, how the world what the world looks like if you live with PCA. And so this was our colleague Simon Ball working with members of the group, trying to animate and in some way interpret or reflect on their experiences. It's about an 8-minute film, but I'm just going to show you about a minute clip of it. And I think Jamie and I can send the link round afterwards if this isn't clear. Jamie, I'll let you cut me off if the sound isn't clear.
Test won't necessarily show much. So if you're looking at A, B, D, E, F, that's not a problem. But if you're trying to read a line,
I get the first word, and when I go on to the second word, first word's gone.
Some from this sentence and some from this sentence, and then coming back up to this sentence. Blobs on a piece of paper. Everything does dance around all the letters, and eventually just becomes one big blur. I've read extensively all my life, and I can barely read. My writing, crowded page, it's moving, it's mutating, it's everything in C, 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 H, U, R, C, 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 H. F's instead of 5, B's instead of P's, P's instead of B's. There's a number of funny little things in my brain. And sometimes some do things, and sometimes others do things.
it's very frustrating to go to get something and it's not there, but it's there.
Okay, did that come through clearly enough? Great. So that's, I think, an example for me at least of how we need to work with a wide variety of people to try and help others to understand what PCA is all about. I think that film, at least for us, has been important not just as an art object in its own right, or as something that people who know or live with PCA themselves can identify with, but also a number of members of our groups have used this in different ways. One person has become, in his own words, an ambassador advocate. So he goes off giving talks and explaining it, for example, to the staff at his wife's care home, because they realize that he knows more about the condition than they do. Someone else, when two members of our group, when one of the gentleman with PCA had to be in hospital for a physical problem, his wife realized he was losing weight because people were just putting food down in front of him and he couldn't see what it was or where it was, and so wasn't able to eat, which they misinterpreted as him just not being hungry. And his wife showed the nurse in charge of the ward this film, and she immediately showed it to all of her colleagues, and suddenly they were much more aware of some of the visual challenges he was having, and his care really improved. So we'd like to think that these sorts of things are really potentially powerful aids for communicating something of the experience of living with PCA. The image I've just put up onto the screen now is of a heat map of the brains of about just under 50 people with PCA who'd kindly had brain scans, along with, in the cold colours, about 30 people who lived with the sort of memory-led form of Alzheimer's disease. So the colours just show the difference in where the disease is having a particular hit. So for people with PCA, the cortex, the grey cells of the brain, the outer layer that does most of the kind of computational processing, is particularly thinning where the colours are hot, so at the back of the brain and towards the top of the brain, so the so-called occipital and parietal lobes. Whereas for the people who have memory-led Alzheimer's disease, the parts of the cortex which are particularly thinner, significantly thinner than in PCA, are the cold colours, more in the temporal lobes, the memory centres of the brain, and some of the front of the brain as well. And I think one of the important things for people, our colleagues, certainly many of my colleagues, to recognise is that not only does this tell us something about what's causing PCA, i.e. it's the back of the brain which leads to these very characteristic set of difficulties and challenges, but also is telling us something about the huge contribution that an understanding of PCA and the participation of people living with PCA in research potentially has, not just for others with PCA, but for others with all forms of Alzheimer's disease. Because as far as we know, everyone who took part in this study had Alzheimer's disease as the underlying cause of their PCA. So really what you're looking at here is a map, a color map of how differently one disease can affect many different people. And I think that's one of the ways in which we are, with our international colleagues, very motivated to find out what is it that causes a condition to affect, in some people, the back of the brain, the visual centers, in other people, the lower parts of the brain, the memory centers. Because if we can understand why it goes to those different parts of the brain, either what's protecting some parts of the brain or making other parts of the brain particularly vulnerable to the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's disease, then that may give us really important clues to future treatments and cures. The next slide is one I showed you a little earlier when I was talking about the man who joined us at a point where he thought he was a bit worried about his memory. but subsequently went on to develop PCA. And the towards the top of the screen, there are the second row of brain scans, is all the pictures we took of his brain, all registered or mapped back onto the first scan. So the second row shows in colour the differences between all of the scans across the top row, where the cold colours show which bits of the brain are shrinking or contracting over time. And so this is scans from 2004 through to 2013. And you can see very much that the green and eventually blue cold colours showing this loss of brain tissue are very much geared towards the back of the brain. It does eventually spread to other parts of the brain, that tissue loss, but it's very much the back of the brain that takes the early hit. And so this shows us that sadly PCA, as far as we understand it, is a degenerative condition that does progress over time. I'm going to just say very briefly, this is just to remind me that when I talked about those 3 different types of vision at the beginning, it's important to recognize that PCA doesn't affect everybody in the same way. So if you meet other people with PCA and their experiences, their symptoms are a little bit different to yours, don't worry. It's not that necessarily that the diagnosis is wrong for one of you or that something else has happened. We understand that it is quite a variable condition. For some people, it's the superior, the upper parts of the brain that take more of a hit early on. And so those people tend to have more difficulty with seeing where things are at a point where they can still see what things are. And other people describe their experiences rather the other way around. And when the atrophy, the cell loss is a bit lower in the brain, sometimes people can have particularly marked difficulties early on with perceiving objects and faces and words clearly, while still being relatively able to see where things are or to navigate around. It affects everyone differently. And so what we look for in our consensus criteria are the common patterns, but allowing for the fact that everyone's experience will be a little bit different. I think when I spoke last time, I mentioned to you some work which had just been published at that time, which was done with a number of colleagues in the States and all around the world, which was to try and come up with a common definition of what PCA is, because we were aware that there were lots of different labels for this condition floating around, things like Benson syndrome, visual variant Alzheimer's disease, biparietal Alzheimer's, all these different labels, and that was causing some confusion about who had what. And when you did a study of PCA, were 2 studies, could you really say that they were comparing and describing the same type of condition? So we did some work together just to make sure that we were all on the same, from the same hymn sheet, all on the same page. And we described the symptoms of PCA at 3 different levels. One was this very general syndrome level, where in particular we said that there would be at least 3 of a set of cognitive features, which include, and this is a very long list, but spatial difficulties, difficulties with objects, this thing called simultanagnosia, so difficulty seeing more than one thing at once or seeing complicated scenes that have multiple parts. Things like constructional dyspraxia, so difficulty drawing or putting things together, difficulty getting lost in perceiving the local environment, a whole slew of different conditions. I won't go through all of them now, but it gave clinicians a list which they could identify. And again, we were quite flexible about which 3 of those things. We didn't say specifically it has to be exactly these 3 things because of this different expression of the condition in different people. So our first level, our classification level 1, was just to describe what is PCA and get a common agreement about that. The second level was still describing the syndrome, the difficulties which people experience and the signs a doctor might notice, but distinguishing people who just fulfill the criteria for PCA, and describing a second group as people with PCA plus, which is people who fulfill the PCA criteria, who have the symptoms of PCA, but who also have some additional symptoms or signs, which mean that they also fulfill the criteria for another degenerative syndrome. And the reason we included this is we had a lot of people coming to our group who, for example, had lots of visual problems, but also, say, had lots of hallucinations, and to whom a doctor might have said, oh, we think you've got dementia with Lewy bodies. And so we wanted to draw together the fact that some people have a very pure visual syndrome, but some people have vision plus hallucinations or sleep difficulties. Some people have vision, but also some quite prominent motor problems, for example, a stiff left arm. And so again, this is trying to reflect the fact it's different for different people. And we didn't want people to be excluded from hearing about PCA and the visual aids and strategies that might help them just because they also had some other symptoms. And then the third level of classification that we talked about was more at the disease level. So what is the cause of these problems that one is noticing? So the light blue, the first two levels are the syndrome level, describing the difficulties people face. The third level is the disease category. So, and the different thickness of lines indicate the fact that, to the best of our knowledge, the majority of people who have PCA have it because of Alzheimer's disease, because of plaques and tangles in their brain. But there are some people who have PCA as a consequence either of Lewy body disease, of something called corticobasal degeneration, or very occasionally a condition called prion disease. And we left a dotted circle because, of course, it's possible in the future that we may meet people with other causes of PCA. But it's trying to get this distinction between what is the problem, what's the consequence of the tissue loss, and what's the cause of that tissue loss at the back of the brain. That was what we were aiming for. I skipped briefly over this slide, but this is really just to say that in our group, one of the developments in our research over the next year will be that we've got some funding for a pathologist to do some research into the type of changes in the brain in people with PCA. For a number of years now, members of our support group and research group have kindly been donating their brain or signing consent saying that when they eventually pass, that they would be willing for their brains to be used for research. And obviously it's a very sensitive topic and not for everyone, but there's now about 25 or 30 people who very kindly made that gift to medical research. And so we will be looking to try and understand the cause of the condition in a little bit more detail, because the slides I've got up on the screen at the moment are pictures of brain tissue from back in the early 90s. A guy called Patrick Hoff, who did the seminal pathological studies and really showed people that for people with PCA, where Alzheimer's disease was the cause, it was really a case of where the plaques and tangles, the protein changes in the brain were. Not that it was a different disease, but it was a disease affecting different parts of the brain. And that was really important in people understanding where PCA fitted amongst other degenerative conditions. These days, we're lucky that we've got other tools to hand. And this is just a picture from a study by the Dutch group and also Gil Ravinich in San Francisco, who I know you know, showing that some of the modern brain imaging techniques that look at proteins in the brain like tau are very good at picking up the changes that we see in PCA. And in particular, in the top left-hand corner, you can see some brain images from people with PCA who have had this special type of imaging, which can see the tau protein in the brain in life. And it's very much the distribution of that tau protein very much maps on very closely to where we see the loss of brain tissue, the change in the structure of the brain, and where we know that there's a loss of metabolism in the brain, which is again in these posterior visual regions. I'm just going to also mention some work we did a couple of years ago, again with this international group, which was trying to understand whether there's any genetic difference between PCA caused by Alzheimer's disease and more common memory-led forms of the condition or expressions of the condition. And it does seem that there are some genetic differences. And so we are keen to work with international colleagues to continue to gather blood samples or other genetic samples so that we can try and replicate this work, which was based on about 300 people who kindly gave samples, because it's really important that we try and understand what is driving this condition to affect one part of the brain in one person and another part of the brain in a different person. And some of those potential early genetic indicators were quite interesting. One of the genes where we found indication of change is a gene which is thought to be involved in the development of the visual system. So it really starts to make us ask questions about, are some people born with a neural structure which is perhaps parts of it, the visual system of which is potentially vulnerable to getting PCA. But these are all very early questions. I think the encouraging thing, as far as we understand it, is I'm yet to see anybody with a convincing family history of PCA. I haven't yet met anybody in our group. I think there is one or two reports out there of a couple of people in a family in different generations, both having PCA, but we remain to be convinced that this can be inherited. So I think the positive, if there can be a positive, is that at the moment our understanding is that if you have PCA and you have children, as far as we understand it, they're at no higher risk and certainly not guaranteed to get it. I don't know how everyone's energy levels are feeling. I'm skipping around slightly with slides. Maybe I'll try and just scoot over just a couple more insights and then perhaps open it up for questions, and then I can always come back to the slides a bit later if that's helpful. One of the things we've noticed in a lot of the people who we've met with PCA in London is that people often have difficulty seeing things when amongst clutter. So this, as with much of our research, this came out when from the comments of people living with PCA, and particularly when a few years ago I was trying to run a memory test with someone with PCA, and I showed her the first page of the memory test, which had the written word gate, and the lady said to me, I can see the G on the beginning and I can see the E at the end, but I can't see the letters in the middle. And what this made us realize is that for people living with PCA, the central vision, the vision in the middle, becomes much more like what my peripheral vision is like. And that is, sometimes things can get cluttered together. So for example, when I ask someone with PCA to look at these three letters and just tell me what the middle letter is, a lot of the people who we've done this test with will say something like, oh, I see a Y. And there isn't a Y there, but there is all the bits that make up a Y. The top of the X joined onto the bottom of the T does actually look like a Y. And so people with PCA are often seeing the world rather differently to me. And this is something we've increasingly referred to as excessive visual crowding. Another thing which surprises a lot of people is that a lot of people with PCA who we've met have more difficulty seeing large things, like large print, than small print, which sounds very counterintuitive. And most people who hear that someone has a visual problem, the first thing they try and do or suggest is to make things bigger. But we heard some extraordinary stories. We heard from one man who came to my colleague Nick Fox's clinic, who had been on the train to work. He was a young man, and he had looked at his daily newspaper and he realized that he could read the small print, but he couldn't read the headlines. But then when he looked further down the carriage, someone else had the same newspaper and he could read their headlines. And that's the sort of thing that if you're young and you go to your family doctor and say something like that, dementia is the last thing they will be thinking. And it sounds a bit odd, it sounds a bit inconsistent, because why could something be seen in one condition but not another. But actually, a bit like the lady looking at Brighton Pier, if we understand that in PCA what you see is a constriction of the effective field of vision, it's not that people are blind around the outside, but the ability to see and integrate lots of information over a wide area becomes degraded. And so a big letter that perhaps requires a lot, which fills lots of that space and requires lots of attention, or requires you to move your eyes several times, is much harder to see than something small that can be absorbed in one fixation, one glance, if you like. And the reason that we look at things like this, why we look into and try and investigate these sorts of comments, is not just to be scientific geeks, or just to try and understand people's experiences, but because we think they have practical implications. So, for example, if you take the example of how people have their eyesight tested to make sure that they've got the right glasses, which even if you've got a brain sight problem, you still want to make sure as much good quality information about the visual world is getting there as you can. Then in this standard acuity chart, which might look familiar to you from when you've had your eyes tested, the top letter is too big for most people with PCA, and the bottom letter is the right size, but they're all crowded together because they're presented on one line. And all one has to do is show one letter at a time of the right size, and then you'll be able to, and then people with PCA, most people with PCA can see it. So it's these simple insights where the comments of people living with PCA can be shared appropriately with diagnosing clinicians and health and social care workers to help them understand and adapt their practice so it's more suitable, more appropriate for people living with these visual difficulties. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to zoom on and just show you one other thing, which is, of course, PCA is known as the visual dementia, but it doesn't just affect vision, as many people living it will attest to. And so we're always interested in understanding all the other aspects of it. And one of the things which struck us a couple of years ago is that someone in our support group asked or mentioned the fact that their mother, who lives with PCA, had recently had to ask them, am I the right way up? Which seems a rather extraordinary question to have to ask for those of us who don't live with PCA. Unless you've been really impressively drunk or very seasick, you've probably never had to ask yourself if you're the right way up before. But what it got us thinking about was things that go beyond normal vision, things that relate to balance and how the brain integrates different senses, vision and the balance sense, you know, the bodily sense of orientation and location, and potentially other senses too. And so we've worked with the colourful pictures at the top of experiments that we've been running with a neuroscientist called Brian Day, finding that actually this sense of the vertical is quite impaired in a lot of people with PCA, and also actually in quite a few people with typical memory-led Alzheimer's disease as well. And we think this sort of work has real implications for people. And I've got in the bottom right, I've got a picture of somebody being rolled over in bed. And that's because we've met a few people. I remember one gentleman living with quite advanced PCA who became quite disturbed, and his carers didn't understand what was going on. They kept describing him as being challenging or resistive, which seemed pretty bit rude and harsh. And I think when you ask the question, well, when is this behavior which you suggest is challenging occurring, it was often when the gentleman was being perhaps rolled over in bed or helped to dress, when he was being moved. And then you think, well, actually, perhaps for that poor man, perhaps being rolled over in bed or rolling himself over in bed felt like falling or something else, in which case reacting would be a completely appropriate thing to do. And certainly amongst our members of our group in London, this concern about balance rang true with a number of people. One couple said that the gentleman who lives with PCA had frequently been walking tilted right over. And when asked by his wife why he didn't stand up, walk straight, he said, "I am straight." So he was tilted over, but perceived himself as being straight. And someone else had experienced it the other way around. He said, "Oh, sometimes when I'm walking along the pavement, I feel like I'm about to fall off the edge of the world." So that sense that he was upright, but felt as if he wasn't. And it's those sorts of experiences which, again, we're really keen to share with people to try and broaden people's idea of what PCA might mean to people, what strange experiences it may bring, and to so that other people don't, at least, even if you're having to cope with that symptom, that you don't think there's something extra wrong with me, that people can begin to recognize these as parts of the condition. So I think I'm going to stop there. I feel I've been talking for long enough, and very happy to talk more, to share, to hear what reflections you might have on some of the stories from members of our group that you've heard, or to try and answer any other questions you have as best I can.
Thank you, Seb. That was amazing. And I'm good. What I'm going to do is, if you have a question, put your hand up, and then I'll unmute you. Okay. Okay. I'm going to get Dave.
Yes, something happened to Shirley this week. First time she fell off her chair in the kitchen. Mm-hmm. And we don't know if this is one of the things now. We ended up putting the chair now with arms on it, but we weren't there to see it, but she actually fell off and hit her head. Right. And luckily, no problems with the MRI. But again, this is the first time that's happened.
Yeah. I'm really sorry to hear that, and I hope you're doing better now. I think a lot of people who I've met have talked about the difficulty of sitting down, which again is something most people don't recognize. But if one stops to think about it, those of us who don't live with PCA, it's actually incredibly complicated. You've got to perceive visually where the chair or stool is. You've then got to try and orient your body to sit into it. And those are all really complicated things. And then having perceived what angle you've got to be at, how high, how low, you've got to get your bum in the seat. And so a lot of people have missed chairs and fallen in the way that you suggest. I think making sure that there's a reasonable contrast between the chair and whatever is behind it can sometimes help. It also reminds me of one of the most amusing stories I've heard, and I realize falling off your chair and banging your head is not at all funny, but one gentleman with PCA who I met said that one of the most amusing things that had happened because of his PCA is he had once sat on his vicar because he had been at a dinner party and he had got up from the table and gone to the loo, and when he came back, he tried to sit down in his empty chair, and he missed it by so far that he didn't actually fall on the floor. He sat in the lap of the guy next to him, who was his vicar from church. So whilst I'm really sorry to hear that you fell, you're certainly not alone. And it is, it may be that gradually using touch a lot more and trying to find other more secure ways of sitting down, or making sure that there's the seats are on a soft surface, so in case you do slip again, maybe something that has to be considered. I'm sorry, it's really, really tough for you.
Any other questions, comments? Raise your hand. Dan? Wait, you have to unmute yourself because it's not working to unmute you. Okay.
No, sorry, I was flagging my wife.
Okay, never mind then. Any other questions? Yes, go ahead, Carmela.
It's George.
George.
Yeah, so you mentioned motor function, and I was curious. One of the problems that we've noticed with Carmela lately is putting on gloves on her left hand. and orienting the fingers to get into the proper fingers of the gloves. And
Yeah.
I'm just curious how much of that is visual or is control of the body. I mean, the example you gave where the video of the man reaching out and missing, in her case, I'm not sure, is the motor function also in the rear of the brain that controls where the body moves, like controlling the fingers to the right place and all that?
Yeah. I think it obviously could be different for different people, but I think what it's most likely to be is to be a combination of the vision, not being so useful for guiding emotion. I don't know if this will ring true for you, Carmela, but also another thing many of us take for granted is knowing where our body is. So for example, right now, if I close my eyes, I can tell that my arm is pointing upwards with my hand above my elbow. And now I've turned my arm and I can feel just from the joint sense, from the things that stretch in my shoulder when I rotate my arm, I now know that my hand is now below my elbow. And all of that information comes to me through the body position sense that I have, which is all pulled together and integrated and understood by the parietal lobes of the brain, exactly the part of the brain which is hit by PCA. And so it's this blending together of visual information and body sense information, and potentially also, as you say, making the motor movement that is required to shape your finger into a glove. All three of those things, I think, could underlie why things like getting your glove on are difficult. And the fact that you mention it's on the left hand also rings true. A little while ago, my colleague Natalie Ryan, who's a neurologist in London, noticed that about a third of the people she was seeing with PCA had some sort of either motor stiffness or difficulty with movement in the left arm. It's not to say it's not possible to have it on the right side, but when we looked at the brain scans, it was just because of a slight imbalance in the way the right side of the brain seemed to have taken the brunt of the disease slightly more than the left. And as we know, the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So again, that rings true as well.
And this also affects my ability to use a fork and knife.
Yeah.
I can't, I mean, it's just so weird. Or even brushing your teeth is kind of difficult, although I got a children's toothbrush that it's not just
it's easier to grab.
Yeah, it's easier to grab. So that.
Yeah.
But I think what you just said, he's had tau and amyloid and inflammation PET scans, and I think the doctor also said that it was skewed towards the right side of her brain, which, like you said, is consistent with the left problem he's having.
I'm sorry, the cutlery, the knives and forks must be really frustrating for you, Carmela. When we first started up our PCA support group in London, one of the reasons why lunch has been at the center of all the support groups that we run, that's the kind of priority, and then we fit talks around it, is because loads of people at our first couple of PCA meetings where we met for a cup of tea talked about how they'd felt that they'd stopped going out for meals because they were so concerned about not being able to use the cutlery, perhaps eating with their hands, sometimes knocking over glasses or reaching and getting food from someone else's plate because you couldn't quite see where it was. And so we just hired out a restaurant and we all met there. And it was great because everyone could relax and they knew that lots of us would be, borrowing food from our neighbour's plate or knocking things over or eating with our fingers. And just to try and normalize it, I'm sure it's sometimes something that people can, in certain situations, feel embarrassed about. But you have many brothers and sisters around the world experiencing similar things.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jordan and Carmela. We have a question from Jennifer.
Hi there, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, my husband was diagnosed at age 50, but I think he was showing symptoms in late 40s. And that was just 2 years ago, the diagnosis. Our neuropsychologist in California seems to think that it's closely linked to the concussion syndrome of subconcussions that occurred during, let's say, high school football.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a link between those concussions or subconcussions in youth and a development later?
So we certainly know that head injury, concussions and subconcussions are a risk factor for dementia in general. I'm not aware of any specific evidence about linking concussion to PCA in particular. But yes, we definitely know that concussion, brain injury, through things like football in the UK here, there are lots of studies going on about people playing rugby, which is kind of our equivalent of American football, heading the ball in soccer, people who've been involved in boxing in their youth, and also people just having minor head traumas. I speak as someone who's fallen off his pedal bike a few times and been concussed. We know that those are all factors, risk factors for later dementia. So it may be linked. We don't think it can be a full explanation of why people get dementia, because we certainly think things like Alzheimer's disease seem to be caused by a combination of genes and our environment and factors like head injury or specific things that have happened to us. But it sadly, it may have contributed.
Okay, wonderful. Any other questions? Yes, Cecil.
A whole bunch of people with questions.
You need to just unmute your thing. I can't do it from here. I'll try. Okay, go ahead.
When you have PCA, it's hard to do new things. Okay, in the spirit of early onset and the trauma that causes, you know, when I got my diagnoses, they were for visuals, and then a year later, they studied the scans and found the PCA. The frustration that I was going through at the time was, hey doc, I just, you know, the brain being a powerful thing, am I just telling myself that all these things are happening and so they're happening? And he said, no, but it is all in your head. All right. This I've been living with since 2012. And I have gone through the whole gambit, losing the ability to write, losing the ability to read, losing the ability to get through the door without whacking myself. Mm. This is quite an adjustment. Now, what does the self-talk got me through it? I decided to switch up and saying, oh my God, this is the new normal, to something a little lighter. But, you know, how much, how much of what is temporary and how much of what is permanent is going to be an individual thing.
Yeah.
For me, the importance of self-talk has gotten through a lot of stuff. I sew, but it was a British archer that told me that anybody can split an arrow in 300 tries that got me back to threading the needle. Like somewhere between 1547, and I've never gone over 138 tries. I got an early onset. I didn't know what was going on. I had services for the blind do the investigation. Mm-hmm. It went here, there, the other place. And by the time they were done, it was PCA. Mm-hmm. But they seemed to, in the retraining process that I was going through and the help that I was getting through services of the blind, they seemed very familiar with the processes that were going on. Mm-hmm. But, and all the stuff they taught, along with the mentor who was also blind, told me the hardest thing they had to get to was not trusting their eyes anymore. Yeah. All of this stuff now, years later, has the retraining has helped a great deal. All of the falling off the sidewalk things, that without retraining, I wouldn't be able to handle a sidewalk at all. Yeah.
Cecil, can I ask you can you just tell us, did you get retraining from the blind organization?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Cecil, you may want to join our support groups. We have 2 support groups, and if you email me. You can find me on Facebook, PCA support. I will tell you when. Today we're meeting patient-only support group at 5 Eastern Standard Time. So that might be good. And I'm going to take some more questions because I know that.
I'm done.
Yeah. Okay. Any other questions? Raise your hand. Yes, Steve. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you very much for your time today, Doctor. It's been very informative. You talked briefly about the underlying, possible underlying causes or conditions associated with PCA. Mm-hmm. While that might be very interesting to you from a research perspective, how important is it for the PCA patient or the caregiver to understand what the underlying condition might be in terms of day-to-day living, in terms of care, or in terms of progression, and what to expect going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's one of the reasons we wanted to try and distinguish between the sort of consequences and the causes, is because there are many, many situations, particularly in everyday life, where the cause matters not one jot. It's the challenges that you're living with. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, if someone has tips or strategies or a visual aid or whatever it is that's helpful, that should be helpful to people irrespective of what the underlying proteins are. The reasons we wanted to articulate the disease level is, for example, we wanted to make sure that people with PCA weren't excluded from new drug trials as they come along, because as we understand it, if there's a new disease-modifying therapy for Alzheimer's disease, either trial or eventually when these things are proven successful, people with PCA should benefit from those every bit as much as people with memory-led Alzheimer's disease. But often people are excluded from those trials, either because people think it's a different thing, or because they don't think about what the cause is, or because they try and assess the effectiveness of those medications using things like a visual memory test, which would be inappropriate for someone with PCA. So I agree with you completely. In the day-to-day, I think the cause matters very little. I think the vast majority of people, Alzheimer's disease is the cause, and the prognosis is no different as we understand it for someone with the visual expression of Alzheimer's disease to someone with a memory expression of Alzheimer's disease. It's possible, though, in the future that we may discover other causes where either the prognosis is a bit different, or things like the symptomatic treatments that we have for Alzheimer's disease, drugs like donepezil, perhaps don't agree with people so well. But as we understand it, I agree with you entirely that most of the day-to-day you should be focusing on the consequences, the challenges you're facing, and not thinking too much about the underlying disease.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. Yes, Norm?
Well, actually, everybody said what I was thinking, especially thank you so much for taking the time. And it's so valuable to actually have the diagnosis, because we had diagnosis of Alzheimer's for 5 years, and it's life-changing to have the diagnosis, and it helps me understand why she's doing things and what's going on, and it helps her. She does not have any memory change or dementia, yet she has this diagnosis, and so I think that's real important for us. And on the tests, I stumbled on the Navon test. Are you familiar with that?
Yep.
And then also, and she saw the small letters, but not the big letters. And then the Ishihara colorblind test, she can't see the numbers, but she sees spots of colors.
Yeah, absolutely. For those who don't know, the Navon test is a test where a big letter is made up out of lots of little letters. And so it's a bit like the fragmented letters I showed you at the very beginning. It's something where someone who can only see the local detail will only see the small and not the whole. So I agree with you entirely.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Anybody on the phone have any questions? I see a number of people on the phone. If you do, just unmute yourself because I can't see you, and ask Dr. Crutch a question. Okay, anybody else? Deanna, Connie, anybody? Questions? Yes, Isabel? You have to unmute yourself.
Yes, You can hear me now? Yes.
Yes.
Me as well.
Thank you so much. This is great. I think it comes really close to being able to maybe help other people see what it all is. How visual spatial loss is not identical to memory loss, and it's a very hard misconception and very hard to explain. Very hard on the people with PCA. We had a physical therapist who did a test, who had been working with people with strokes, and she did a test with Mark where she had checked where his visual center was, and that was the first person who actually took interest in doing that, which was quite amazing. The result was quite amazing, which also then explains why when he's, well, maybe not completely, but why also when he sits down, he moves, he moves to one side. And then the neurologist in Belgium that we consulted said that PCA was not a diagnosis, which made me very upset. But so just wanted to know what you thought about that.
Well, in short, I think that's nonsense.
Okay.
Because I think we could just go back to Norm, who said that having a diagnosis, having a label, having some understanding of what this thing is that you're trying to cope with is helpful. And yes, there are diagnoses that happen at different levels, sometimes describing the problem, sometimes telling you what the cause is. But I think, as we were talking about with Steve, knowing the disease name doesn't necessarily tell you what to do about it if it's affecting your vision rather than your memory. So I think knowledge is power, and people why are you guys all together being able to talk and share each other's experiences? It's because as someone like Jamie has brought you together by virtue of having this label. So I don't think labels are perfect by any means. We don't, for example, in our group, we don't insist on people having a diagnosis, because a lot of people self-diagnose, their doctors haven't spotted it, and what they recognize is the similarity of experience that they're going through compared to other members of the group. So I don't think people should be blocked if they don't have a diagnosis. But I think having a common language with which to talk about these experiences is very important.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Seb. So would we be able to get a copy of the Queen's diagnostic test you showed us?
Yeah, absolutely. I can send.
It would be nice to take that and share it, if I could, with our members. And anybody who has any questions or comments could come through me, and I will get you to Dr. Crutch. You've been amazing. Thank you so much.
So one last thing I wanted to mention was really to thank you, Jamie, on behalf of everyone else for what you do in bringing everyone together. As you know, we've been running our support groups in London since 2007, and we're really keen to keep in touch with other groups like yours, and to see these groups seeded elsewhere around the world, because it's so important. One good piece of news we had a couple of weeks ago is that we've just been funded for a major 5-year study to look at the support groups themselves. So we run support groups for people with PCA, but also for a couple of other rarer dementias. And that's something where we want to be able to demonstrate the value that being able to talk with others who are in a similar situation can have for people. So if you don't mind, I might share with you, once we're up and running, some of the details of that study, which would involve having phone conversations. If anyone would be willing to be participating in that, that'd be really helpful, and to understand the connection that you brought, even though you don't meet physically together, that even by being on the phone, on Skype or Zoom together, that what that has for you. It'd be really great to communicate that to other people.
That would be amazing. We had a patient and caregiver support group for the first year, and then this second year, patients have asked, in the early stages of disease, have asked, can we have our own group? So we just started that group with Bonnie Wong as our PCA neuropsychologist. You must know her from Brad Dickerson's group, and it's amazing how that, so we've had 3 groups for a patient-only group, and we're meeting again today. It's once a month, and the sharing is so different. Like with no offense to you caregivers out there, but the sharing was so different. and we just both like, you know, really got it. And then we, you know, we're so we would love, I mean, if you want to have a guest, one of your scientists come talk to our support group or listen, you know, you're welcome to do that. We'd love to have you.
Fantastic. Well, we'll share more about the study with you, Jamie, and maybe you could circulate it around to people if it's helpful.
Wonderful. Thank you,
Great.
everybody. See you later.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you all. That was great. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. Bye.
Bye.